Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our medical business line leader and global director here at Intertech. And today I am joined by the wonderful Nicholas Abundante, who is our EMC chief engineer. So thank you so much, Nick, for joining me.
Thanks, Clarissa. Hey, everybody. I'm Intertech's global chief engineer for EMC. I do a lot of stuff related to standards work with CISPR-A and the TCB Council Board of Directors, as well as with the ANSI C63 working groups that write a lot of EMC standards. And I think today, though, we're going to talk about something else, which is the new FDA Medical EMC Guidance, which was just recently published. Right, Clarissa?
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to talk about that. But before we launch into the FDA guidance, which is so important, maybe you can tell us a little bit about why EMC matters so much to medical device manufacturers and why this is on the radar of people like the FDA publishing these new guidances.
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, EMC is just it's electromagnetic compatibility, right? So it means both, does the device cause effects on other devices around it, and can it be affected by things around it in an adverse way? And for medical devices, this is especially important because if a medical device doesn't work as intended, or gives a false reading, or there's some sort of error, it doesn't work when it's needed, there's so many bad things that can happen because of that. So it's a critical issue from an FDA perspective. Not just the FDA, but regulators around the world, in fact.
Yeah, especially as we see, right, as medical device manufacturers, risk managements and risk assessments have to be developed. And now we're having to consider all of these EMC elements even more than we were previously, right, as part of our overall risk assessment or risk evaluation because of the connectivity of the environments in which devices are going into.
Yeah, absolutely. More and more devices have radios in them these days. I mean, we've had them for quite some time, but now they're starting to have 3 and 4 radios in them instead of just one like they have in the past. I mean, years ago, we used to have these conversations about adding one radio. Yeah. And now we're talking about, the coexistence of various radios and all sorts of different things together. Yeah, so it's definitely getting more complex, and the standards are getting more explicit about what is desired here as well. I mean, we've seen an evolution in the standards over the years through 2nd, 3rd, and 4th edition of IEC 60601-2, which is, of course, the medical EMC standard that's generally used for most products. And that, used to be very vague about what was required, and it's gotten quite explicit about what needs to be considered as part of the risk process related to EMC hazards specifically. So it's definitely been a journey, and it continues to go. So I guess we're here to talk about some of the latest developments in that.
Yes, right. So the FDA published that guidance recently, right? Just back last month in June, a new guidance about EMC and how it applies to medical devices. So what can you tell us about this new guidance and what it means for medical device manufacturers?
Yeah, it's actually called FDA Medical EMC Guidance. And
makes that easy.
Yeah, and it was published on June 6, 2022. And that's relevant because there's a transition period at play here. There's 2 different types of devices, I guess you want to say, that this covers. And one is in vitro diagnostic, which is a class of devices all by itself, laboratory equipment and IVD equipment, we call it. But then there's everything else, right? And so this guidance applies to both, and it has 2 different transitions within it. So for IVD, there's a longer transition of a whole year after publication. So the companies there have a little bit longer to get up to speed because the changes there are a little bit more drastic than elsewhere. For the rest of the devices, it's a 60-day transition before the concepts in here actually have to be implemented. And so since it was published on June 6th, that means people need to be aware of this by August 5th for submissions to the FDA.
Yeah, so we're already a week and a half into that 60-day timeline.
Passing fast, yeah. By the time people see this, it may be even closer or even past at that point. So certainly something to be aware of. And it does apply to new applications, not to ones that were submitted before this deadline or which have already been approved. And they clarify that within the guidance, actually, if anybody wants to go look. So this actually replaces some existing guidance that was from 2016, and they came out with a draft of this back last year around November timeframe. And this actually fast-tracked because it's out already in June 6th. And there's a number of different things. You want to get into those changes? Or
Yeah. Let's dive into some of the major changes that we're seeing and how those might impact manufacturers from an overall, testing perspective or documentation perspective.
Sure. Well, let's start with IVD equipment. So this is laboratory and in vitro diagnostic equipment. And one of the big things is that, leading up to this, we've seen occasionally from the FDA through, for example, the 510K process, we've seen the FDA asking for things like testing laboratory and IVD equipment to, for example, the medical standards, the 60601-1-2 fourth edition standards, instead of 61326, which is usually what's used for laboratory equipment. And we've seen different flavors of that. Often it takes the form of asking IEC 61326 to be used, but with test levels from fourth edition. Yeah. And they've actually codified that now in the guidance. So they've actually explicitly stated that now. And it's nice because whereas we were getting this sort of piecemeal before, now this levels the playing field for everybody, because now labs are aware of this consistently, manufacturers are aware of it consistently. So it's great for everybody to know this and be on the same page about it. It is a new requirement, and it will be a bit of a stretch for manufacturers of IVD devices to ramp up to this, because the test levels are higher than what they've used in the past.
So as an IVD manufacturer, you would test to the 61326 standard plus the 4.1 test levels, but not receive a full 4.1 summation testing report?
Yeah, and in fact, the guidance recommends that IVD equipment and laboratory equipment is tested using the 61326 series of standards, either the -1 or the -2-6, depending on what's appropriate for the particular device. Because -1 applies to general laboratory and -2-6 applies to IVD equipment specifically. And it recommends testing using those test methods, but using the test levels as specified in 60601-1-2. And they do stress throughout this document that this is guidance and recommendations, and that when you get to the FDA, you could conceivably justify a different approach. Use of consensus standards is always the easiest way, but considering or justifying why, for example, the test levels might not have been appropriate for your particular device is a possibility still here. But the starting point is now to consider using the test levels of fourth edition, which was a bit of a surprise for a lot of manufacturers when the FDA would tell this to them directly during the 510K review. So now
they've kind of leveled the playing field a little bit there to make it a little bit clearer going forward.
And also, it's fair warning, right? Because this way people find out about it before they get to the submission stage rather than at the submission stage.
And having to scramble and do additional retesting to different levels or come back and do something different. Absolutely.
And you're on a timeline at that point once you've done your submission. So it's a bit more hectic at that point. So getting it out of the way ahead of time is good. So that's a big change for IVD equipment that IVD manufacturers and laboratory equipment manufacturers should be aware of. Some of the other stuff that it talks about, though, not related to IVD specifically, it talks about things like that there's other standards that might come into play here. So, for example, for medical devices, normally IEC 60601-1-2 is used. And for implants, usually ISO 14117 or ISO 14708 is used. But this guidance actually explicitly states that it's recognized that these standards don't cover all the environments that these devices might be exposed or used in. And it highlights specifically doing things like testing to aircraft standards, such as RTCA DO 160 when the device is going to be used in an aircraft and environment. Now, that's hinted at in fourth edition, but it's not necessarily mentioned at all in ISO standards. So having that clarification is also useful. And they also bring up things like MRI standards, for example. There's a standard in there referenced ISO TS 10974, which is for implants exposed to MRIs. And they reference that any device that could be exposed to an MRI should consider whether that standard might be applied. So that it doesn't stop there, but those are some examples.
Yeah, so now as a manufacturer, you may be considering not only that fourth edition Amendment 1 or fourth edition EMC standard, but also looking at these standards or some pieces of these standards in conjunction with it to fully kind of satisfy this guidance document when you're making your submission, specifically on, this EMC side for your 510K.
Right. Notably aircraft standards like the one we just mentioned, automotive standards like CISPR 25, or railway standards like 50121 series, for example. That's nice to have that clarification. It is extra requirements, of course, so more testing, but it is good to know that the FDA is looking for. I mean, that's one of the real nice things about having this document. It tells people what the FDA is looking for and what the FDA is expecting so that they can come up with a smoother application and get through with less questions and pushback from the FDA, which is, of course, what everybody
right? Absolutely, right. So along the lines of like clarity and better understanding of what the FDA is looking for, we talked a little bit about the fourth edition of the medical EMC standard, as well as the fourth edition Amendment 1. Do they call out either version of the standard in the document, in terms of, okay, you should be going to the fourth edition or fourth edition Amendment 1? I know we hear a lot about, state of the art and some of the, notified bodies or other regulators looking towards that. So is there anything that kind of points manufacturers towards one or another versions of the standard?
Yeah, in the guidance, there really isn't. It just mentions the general approaches to it, and it's fairly silent on which edition you have to use. You really need to look elsewhere for that kind of information. Mm-hmm. For example, the CDRH has a consensus standards website. The CDRH is one of the offices within the FDA that manages this, and they have a list of these consensus standards. And if you look at that, what it'll tell you is that the 4.1 edition of the medical standard, i.e. C60601-1-2, that transition date is on December 17th, 2023. So that's coming up rapidly, about a year and a half, I guess. And after that date, you're going to need to meet 4.1 fully in order to actually do the submission for a device that would be subject to that standard. Before then, you can get away with just fourth edition, but not entirely, because the guidance actually goes on in some places, and it tells the reader that they should be familiar with the common emitters in their intended use environment. And this is something that fourth edition said anyway, but now the FDA guidance is echoing it. Mm-hmm. And it says that the manufacturer who's doing this should take these things into account during their risk management process. And they actually highlight some specific technologies that they're concerned about, which is another thing that we've been hearing about through the 510K process in a less formal way in the past. So it's good to have this guidance as well, just to clarify things. And some of the things they're actually concerned about are RFID, for example, which is one of the things that's covered by edition 4.1. So from that standpoint, even though the transition hasn't occurred yet, you're probably still going to get asked for some form of RFID compliance. Other things that they are concerned about include, for example, metal detectors and electronic article surveillance systems, for which currently there's not really a lot of standards out there right now. NFC devices as well, that's similar to RFID. And then there's other things like wireless power transfer of 5G radio. They highlight the fact that in the fourth edition of the standard, i.e. C60601-1-2, they have a proximity wireless radio test. And there's some example radios in there, but it does not include 5G. And I think it's safe to say that these days, 5G is becoming more ubiquitous, and that medical devices that are exposed to cell phones are likely to be exposed to 5G or near other 5G emitters, such as repeaters or base stations on towers and things like that. So the environment has 5G in it now, and people need to recognize that. So the FDA is highlighting that. They're also mentioning that, hey, it's not just radios. You need to take into account other medical emitters like MRIs, electrosurgical generators, and diathermy equipment. So it behooves everyone to be aware of what's in the environment. And this is not just today, this is over the expected service life of the equipment. So there's a little bit of continuing compliance aspect to this here as well.
Yeah, and I love thinking about, continuing compliance, because that's a theme that we're seeing a lot recently, right, across different regulators or across different types of submissions. This idea of, okay, it's not just, you place the market on, out into the field, right? There is this level of continuing compliance. And when you look at it from an EMC perspective, as you mentioned, right, things like 5G, which were not considered before because it wasn't a thing that was going to have to be considered, right? Now you're having to think about this as, these different types of technologies advance so rapidly, and your product may be out in an environment or exposed somewhere, into something that you had no idea would have existed before. So this idea of, okay, we have to be monitoring the environments that our products are being used in on a regular basis. Or if someone's, wearing them, as you say, going through a metal detector, or going, now that we see this at not just airports anymore, right? You may have metal detectors at grocery stores or shopping malls, right? You could be exposed to that at any given time.
Exactly. It's becoming more ubiquitous, and it's a bit of a moving target. As you say, it's hard to do at the time that you're doing the initial testing because you just don't know what's going to be out there, right? It's hard to predict the future, but the expectation is that over the whole service life of the product that it will comply. And so that means that not just the radios, but also, making sure that the manufactured samples that are hitting the market today continue to comply as well, because manufacturing processes can change, components can change, things like that. So there's a lot of reasons to do continuing compliance, not just to keep up with the radio stuff, for sure.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And then I think too, with everything that we're adding in terms of radio and RFID and 5G and all these different things, right? We have to also then think about essential performance, right? And how it impacts that, because, things that maybe were not considered before now might be, impacting your essential performance.
Yeah, especially if you've put a radio in your device.
Yeah, right.
5G radio, right? Because then that opens you up to a whole bunch of different stuff, right? Because there's now a new ingress point to your device. It's more vulnerable than it was. And there may be other things that affect the essential performance, right? Like the radio link, depending on what it's used for, could be critical, or it may be less important. And that needs to be addressed now in hazard analysis. And of course, that means it's also subject to all these emitters in the environment too, as well. So it's a whole system of things working together that need to be considered. And speaking of that, there are some things that come into play at that point, right? So, for example, C63.27, the coexistence standard.
Of course, let's talk coexistence.
Yeah, so the FDA, whenever they see a radio has been added to a device, they want to see this coexistence testing. And that's to the standard ANSI C63.27 these days. It used to be more ad hoc, but since the standard's been published, they prefer to see it through that approach. Now, of course, like I said earlier, with anything, alternate methods can be used other than consensus standards, but there needs to be a justification of why it is equivalent or sufficient in those cases. And so our audience may be aware that there's a new version of C63.27 out.
Yeah. And so with that standard, right, with the coexistence standard, what is that doing that goes above and beyond what you might already be testing to in 4th edition or 4th edition Amendment 1? What are we considering, and what is the intent of that standard?
Yeah, it's a good question, because a lot of people think it's just more immunity, right? So, and it's similar. There is a lot of overlap. And in fact, I've talked to the FDA in the past, and they've indicated that in some cases, C63.7 might actually, .27, might actually replace some immunity testing if it covers the right frequencies and bands and technologies and things like that. So it's one of the ways of dealing with things like RFID immunity and other EAS immunity, things like that, where there may not be always a standard available. There is for RFID, of course, but .27 provides a lot of options. And the idea here is coexistence. It's not immunity. The expectation is that the link is going to break because it's a test of the radio link. And basically, you put the radio in an environment where it's exposed to other radios in the same band or in adjacent bands or similar technologies, or anything it could be really exposed to, depending on the severity level of what you're trying to actually do, because there's different levels of criticality here. For the more severe ones, you do more testing, and for the less important ones, you do less. But generally, the approach is to just put things together and see where they break, which is different from immunity. Immunity, you actually expose a device to a particular test level or modulation and see if it breaks. If it doesn't, it passes. If it breaks, it fails, right? But for coexistence, the expectation is it's going to break at some point. You're going to bring the devices close enough together where something is going to happen. And the whole point of this testing, this coexistence testing, is to see what happens and then be able to figure out whether that's a problem or not. So the output of this goes into the risk management process, and there's actually a whole standard for that. It's AMI TIR 69, and it just tells you what to do. Like when you've determined what happens when the system breaks, is that a major risk? How do you want to deal with that from a hazard analysis, essential performance, and a risk mitigation perspective? So it's a little bit of a different approach. The FDA definitely sees it that way. And it can be used for some of these immunity things, like I said. Now, there's a new version out, the 2021 version. The old one's from 2017. The 2017 version is the one that's currently recognized by the FDA. But looking at the 2021 version, there's not a lot of major changes as far as a backwards compatibility standpoint. They added a few more example test cases, and they explained some differences between immunity and coexistence a bit better. And the really only other thing that they did was added a normative annex, which helps to better explain a concept called likelihood of coexistence, which is really what we were just talking about. Where does it break, and what happens when it does? And that feeds into the risk management process. So from a standpoint of being able to do testing to the new version and have it be accepted by the FDA, it doesn't seem like that would be a major stretch. I don't know when it's going to be adopted, the new version, but again, you can use alternate methods, and the latest version that does everything the same is probably just as good as the version before it. So.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good thing to remember, and a good point that you bring up, right? That standards are one way to show compliance in any submission, right? So it's easy to follow the standards. It is easy to lean on that when you're trying to put together a submission. But of course, there's always alternate methods or justifications for using one version versus another, or sometimes dependent upon the risk management of the device, right? You may have to go above and beyond because, to your point, right, when you're considering what the risks are, safety and EMC and cyber and otherwise, right, you may decide that the test levels specified aren't representative of the risks or your appetite for risk, right, with your own product or device.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes it's actually that there's multiple choices, right?
Right.
You might have a couple options. And in one situation, we were talking about RFID a few minutes ago. That's a case where that comes up. So for RFID, you have the edition 4.1 of the medical standard, which does cover some RFID, but without the specific modulations. And then you've got what I call the RFID standard, but it's AIM 7351731. And that one actually simulates the actual RFID signals with the actual modulations. And the FDA in the past has asked for that. But interestingly enough, in this guidance, they actually come out and say something which was not clear in the past, but they actually say that they recommend use of either the AIM 7351731 standard or IEC 60601-1-2 2020 edition 4.1 for the RFID immunity. So that's an interesting development too. There's also a new version of the AIM standard as well, Rev 3, and I can tell you both the Rev 2 and Rev 3 are on the consensus standard list. So for RFID, there's a couple different ways to do things.
And I think it's interesting too, and you alluded to this earlier, right? This is such a moving target. So, we can't expect that any standard is ever going to be finished and ready, or any guidance is going to be finished and ready, because things are changing at such a rapid pace. And we see these amazing advancements in medical technology, as well as the technology that impacts us in our day-to-day lives, right? So, to assume that you could check one day and the consensus standard is listed and you have a clear plan, that could change within weeks, within days, months, whatever it might be, because things are just constantly changing. It is really a moving target when you're looking at, how to identify a test plan or what makes the most sense for your product or device.
Indeed. Yeah. Yeah. So there's another interesting thing that this guidance came up with too, which is that it recognizes that some medical devices have no essential performance. This has been a topic that's come up from time to time with the FDA and medical devices, whether or not a device could even have no essential performance. That's been a debated topic in the past. But they've clarified it, and they say that, yeah, they can. Maybe they don't have essential performance, but even if they don't, it does say that you still need to do immunity testing and at least make sure that the device is safe and performs as intended. So you still need to figure out what the appropriate pass-fail criteria are, even in a case where there's no essential performance. So this guidance document, it's really helpful. And I recommend that anybody who is looking at doing a submission to the FDA or doing some testing in a test lab anytime in the near future for EMC, I highly recommend getting a copy of this and reading through it, because it definitely provides a lot of insight. There's a lot of stuff that we can't cover here today that might be useful to a particular person in a particular application. So it's definitely good to be able to see what the FDA is thinking and expecting with this document. So.
Yeah. And again, as you noted, right, it's only applicable to any sort of new submissions, nothing that has previously already gone through the process, which is great to know for moving forward, especially since there is kind of this tight timeline on, the deadline of, I think you said early August, correct?
Yeah, August 5th would be the 60-day timeline. Yep, for all devices other than IVD.
Perfect. And then, as we know, with everything that the FDA puts out, it's always easily accessible on their website. They make it quite easy to find the guidance documents. It's very helpful in terms of, looking towards the future.
Yep. If you search for FDA guidance documents, you'll probably get the page in one of the top hits, and there it's fairly easy to do a little bit more searching and find what you're looking for.
Yeah, quite applicable. Well, Nick, thank you so much for sharing this with us today. This was such an interesting topic. Is there anything else you want to draw people's attention to in the document, or any final words that you think are important for manufacturers to remember as they're moving forward with their EMC test planning and journey?
Well, in the words of a great person, if you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance. And the FDA certainly echoes that from time to time when I speak to them. I don't think that there's anything else that it's worth highlighting at this point. I think we've covered all the highlights. I definitely will encourage people to read it, though, because there are other things that may be useful in there. Just probably doesn't rise to the level of this podcast. Yeah. So.
Perfect. Well, so appreciate you having you with us today. And if anyone has questions, they can email us, reach out to me, and I will be happy to pass those on to Nick and get responses back. And I'm sure we'll have more future EMC topics to discuss as we go forward. So really appreciate your time, and everybody, thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to our next discussion. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.